Martha Johnson, an 82-year-old widow, lived alone in a small wooden house on the outskirts of Pine Creek, a small town in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Over the past 5 years, her eyesight had gradually deteriorated, until finally, the world around her was plunged into complete darkness. Despite her blindness, Martha stubbornly refused to move in with her daughter Abigail in Pittsburgh, insisting that she was doing great on her own. Martha's house stood on the edge of the woods, and over the years she had studied every corner of it, every creaking floorboard, every chipped porch step. Her movements around the house were honed to automatism. Her fingers remembered the way to every item in the cupboards. However, loneliness weighed on her more and more every day. After the death of her faithful Labrador buddy 3 years ago, the silence in the house became unbearable. One rainy October evening, Martha was sitting in a rocking chair on the veranda, wrapped in a knitted blanket. A sudden noise at the trash cans caught her attention. Splashing through the puddles with her old slippers, she headed towards the source of the noise with her arms outstretched. Martha thought, listening to the rustle. She was answered by a soft whimper, reminiscent of the sounds her buddy used to make when he was a puppy. Martha's heart trembled. Feeling the wet, trembling back of the animal, she decided that it must be a stray puppy lost in a storm. The creature didn't resist when she picked it up. It was heavier than she expected, but still light enough to carry it home. In the warmth of her kitchen, Martha dried the foundling with a towel, fed him the remains of the evening stew, and made him a cot out of an old blanket in the corner by the stove. "I'll call you Charlie," she decided, stroking the animal's thick fur. His ears seemed pointy, and his nose was more elongated than Buddy's. But Martha decided that this must be some other breed of dog. With Charlie's arrival, Martha's life was filled with new meaning. She resumed her morning walks, holding onto the harness she had made for him. Neighbors were surprised to see a blind old woman cheerfully walking along a path along the forest, and her unusual pet trotting next to her. The warning signs began to appear gradually. Mr. Parker, the postman, once refused to deliver letters to Martha's house, claiming that her dog caused him genuine horror. Mrs. Donovan, a neighbor, stopped coming in for a cup of tea after Charlie growled at her in a strange, not at all canine way. But Martha shrugged off all warnings. For her, Charlie was the perfect companion. He never barked for no reason, always came back when she called, and faithfully lay by her bed every night. In the spring, Martha noticed that Charlie began to disappear more often at night, returning at dawn with the smell of damp earth and something metallic that she mistook for rabbit blood. Hunting instinct, she thought with a smile, remembering how her late husband Frank had talked about his hound. In June, pets began to disappear in the district. First, the Thompsons' cat disappeared, then the sheep on the Rivers farm. The local newspaper that Tyler, a neighborhood boy, read to Martha on Sundays, reported on an unknown predator terrorizing the neighborhood. One evening, Sheriff Jenkins appeared on Martha's doorstep. His voice sounded strained when he asked if he could take a look at her pet. Martha called Charlie, but he just growled softly from under the bed, refusing to come out. The sheriff suggested checking on him later and left, but Martha heard the alarm in his voice. She couldn't sleep that night. Touching Charlie's fur, his breathing, something had changed. She ran her hands over his body, noting details she hadn't noticed before. His overly muscular body, the odd shape of his muzzle, and the unusually long fangs. In the morning, her daughter Abigail knocked on the door, arriving unannounced. "Mom," her voice trembled, "they say on the internet that a coyote has been seen in your forests, but judging by the tracks and attacks, it's something bigger. Maybe a wolf." At that moment, Charlie came out of the bedroom and stood next to Martha. Abigail's scream filled the room, and Martha felt real fear for the first time. She stretched out her trembling hands to her pet, feeling his tense muscles ready to jump. "Oh my God, Mom, it's not a dog. This is—" Abigail stammered, retreating to the door. Martha slowly knelt down next to the creature that had been living in her house for almost a year. Her hand slid over his powerful neck, pointed ears, and long muzzle. She finally realized that she had taken in a wolf, a gray forest predator that miraculously allowed an old blind woman to consider him a pet. A soft snort rang out in the silence of the room, and Martha felt a rough tongue lick her palm. It was a gesture of affection that couldn't be faked. The residents of Pine Creek couldn't believe the story of the blind old lady and her pet wolf. The authorities insisted that the animal should be transferred to the reserve. Biologists came to study an unusual case of interspecific attachment. The journalists were besieging a small house on the edge of the forest. But nothing has changed for Martha. She was still walking with her Charlie along the forest paths. Now, however, Abigail always went with them, who decided to move to her childhood home to keep an eye on her stubborn mother and her unusual companion. In the end, the authorities had to make an exception. Martha was given a special permit to keep a wild animal, subject to regular visits by a veterinarian and representatives of the Nature Protection Service. And Charlie remained what he always was in Martha's eyes. A creature who found her in the dark and decided to stay, overcoming the instincts of his kind. Perhaps he was lonely in the woods too, or maybe he saw in the blind old woman a soul as lost as his own. With the onset of autumn, Martha often sat on the veranda, listening to the rustle of the forest, and Charlie lay at her feet, occasionally raising his head when the distant howl of wolves could be heard from the thicket. But he never answered the call of his wild brethren. His place was here, next to a man who had never seen his true form, but had somehow seen his soul. It was a joke in the town that blind Martha Johnson had found the most faithful watchman one could wish for. And Martha just smiled, knowing that she had found something more. Proof that sometimes you don't need to see with your eyes to really get to know someone.